Welcome to today's episode of Buildings Hub Live, where we spotlight the change makers and technologies leading the charge to electrify our built environment. On our podcast, we tackle the multifaceted issues facing building electrification, from space heating to water heaters to electric cooking and beyond. On today's episode, we'll hear from two companies working to deploy thermal energy networks and electrify communities with carbon-free geothermal heat. For this conversation, we'll sit down with Christy Egg, Marketing Director at Egg Geothermal, and Eric Bosworth, Senior Program Manager at Eversource Energy, to learn about the prospect of scaling district geothermal systems across the United States. Here's your host, Atlas Policy Analyst, Zach Strauss.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 7th episode of Buildings Hub Live. My name is Zach Strauss, Policy Analyst at Atlas Public Policy, and I have the pleasure of being your host today. For today's episode, we'll sit down to discuss thermal energy networks and their role in supplying buildings, campuses, and entire neighborhoods with carbon-free geothermal heating and cooling. Where are thermal energy networks deployed around the country? How do they work? What pilots are ongoing? And how might government policy and funding accelerate their adoption? Stay with us today to find out. Before we jump into our discussion, a quick note on Buildings Hub. Here at Atlas, we manage a one-stop shop data analysis tool for building sector electrification called Buildings Hub. If you're interested in heat pump market share, state policies and funding programs, the current makeup of the U.S. housing stock, federal grants, we've got you covered, and a lot more. We just launched our newest dashboard, surfacing all of the data from the Department of Energy's latest residential energy consumption survey, where you can find state-level information about building elements like heat pump deployment to induction cooking to home heating fuel mixes and beyond. Check it out today. We'd love to have you join the Buildings Hub community. We even put a link here below. Take a look. Now, for today's event, we're currently live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and we encourage our audience to send us over your questions, and we'll put them in as we go along. You can do so through the Q&A portal through our YouTube channel. We look forward to hearing from you throughout our episode today. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our superstar geothermal speakers. We are joined by Christy Egg, Marketing Director at Egg Geothermal, and Eric Bosworth, Senior Program Manager for Clean Technologies at Eversource Energy. Welcome to the both of you, and thank you so much for being here today on Buildings Hub Live. So we have lots to cover in only about half an hour, so we're going to jump right in. So from a high-level perspective, what are y'all's roles in the building decarbonization and thermal energy network space? What do you do at your respective companies to deploy and enable community-scale geothermal systems? We're going to start with Christy.
Thanks, Zach. Thank you so much for having me on. This is a great opportunity. Let's see. At Egg Geo, I'm the marketing director, so I do my best to get out the information about thermal energy networks and about what we can do as consultants, engineers. We have a great geothermal scientist on staff. Basically, just inform people about what is available for thermal energy networks. And so that can really be a tough job. I mean, there are so little known by the general public just what is available for thermal energy networks. I also heard cats in the fact that if you've ever been trapped in a room with engineers, you know how difficult that can be. And I know Eric's laughing because, it's hard. But really, I think it's a difficult position, marketing in any industry, but really in the geothermal industry, it's extremely difficult because, like and I think probably Eric knows too, geothermal is still an unknown quantity. And pass it over to Eric.
Yep. Thanks, Christy, and thanks, Zach, for having me. So my role at Eversource is I'm a program manager in our Clean Technologies department. Specifically, as it relates to geothermal, that means I'm responsible for implementation of geothermal projects that we deploy as a utility. Right now, we have an ongoing pilot in Framingham, Massachusetts. And so I've been responsible kind of from the site selection phase of this project all the way staring down construction this year, getting it into the ground and operating. I also do a little bit of work looking longer term at what geothermal networks may mean for the company and how we may be able to deploy them more broadly throughout our service territory.
Thanks so much for that to both of you. And you're right, it's an unknown quantity. It's important to get that message out. And we're looking forward to hearing more about that pilot project as we talk through our conversation today. So Christy, as you mentioned, we don't know a lot of people don't know much about this technology. So for the uninitiated, can you explain at a high level for our audience what a thermal energy network is? Why should we invest in them? And what roles do they play in the larger building electrification conversation?
Absolutely. So basically, a thermal energy network is where you take buildings, they can be commercial buildings, they can be residential buildings. A good example, churches, schools, campuses. We have a project right now in Manhattan. We have one in the Bronx that are residential apartment buildings. And we call it a campus, right? 15, 22-story buildings, or a number of buildings that you basically, a thermal energy network is a utility scale infrastructure project, basically, and we connect multiple buildings into a shared network. But we use sources of thermal energy, so like geothermal boreholes, surface water, wastewater. So you're connecting them through water, and you're using this water to exchange BTUs instead of connecting them together in any other way. So you're basically using heat pumps, and everybody, I think, is familiar with heat pumps. So it's the exchange, the sharing of a load, heating and cooling through hydronics, and it saves energy. And so basically from a high perspective looking down, instead of having natural gas or fossil fuels, you're sharing hydronics. And it's a brilliant use of an older technology. This is nothing new. This is basically returning back to something that has always worked.
Thank you. Yeah, just to highlight, we've had one in the country since 1890. The first was in Boise,
Yes.
Idaho. It connects about 90 buildings across the entire downtown. And it's been in use since the 19th century. So hopefully we can scale it up in the 21st century for all of the needs we have today. Talking about a real project. So Eric, Eversource Energy is conducting an innovative pilot where the utility is installing a community-scale geothermal system in an entire neighborhood to allow customers to benefit from carbon-free geothermal heating and cooling. Can you tell us more about this project? What was the impetus for y'all doing this? What are the goals, the timelines, and importantly, what are the costs?
Sure. So to give a little bit of background on the project, it was the result of actually a gas rate case here in Massachusetts that enabled us to move forward with the project. We had been working for quite a period of time looking at what the decarbonization pathways for the utility are in the regions that we operate. And we've also been engaging with folks, local stakeholder groups and others that are interested in this technology. So as a part of that rate case, we proposed to perform a pilot project that would involve constructing one of these thermal networks and connecting up a bunch of various loads, as Christy pointed out, commercial, residential, some low-income apartment buildings, and really demonstrating, A, that the utility is able to deploy projects at this scale, and B, that it makes sense for us to do this because we're doing work that's very similar to day-to-day gas or electric infrastructure work. We're installing water mains in the street, we're drilling boreholes, we're connecting it all together, and we're really facilitating that energy delivery to customers. And so when you try to go and speak with a customer about hooking up to a ground source system, being the utility and offering that reliability, and yes, we are your energy provider, I think you have a much higher chance of making that case versus them deciding on their own to go out and pursue the technology.
And just a curiosity for me, how did y'all decide in Framingham, why that community, why that neighborhood?
Yeah, so landing on Framingham was actually kind of the first step of the process once we had approval. We went through a pretty rigorous site selection process where we looked across the service territory at general areas that would make sense to deploy a network like this. We then developed a set of screening criteria looking at what the actual loads were, what the geology looked like, if we had space to site bore fields, a number of factors. And we put it through a really quantitative process to score each of the potential sites. At the end of the day, this specific neighborhood in Framingham came out to the top. That's not to say that we couldn't deploy thermal networks in the other areas. It was just we were trying to find the site that had the highest chance of success for our first step out on a geothermal network.
And just to put my pulse on this, because I have so many questions about this, what are the expected benefits that this community is expected to receive as part of being a part of this pilot? Is it emissions reductions? Are they going to cost savings? How, what are they expected to, how are they expected to benefit essentially from this pilot?
I think both of those are two major benefits here. To Christy's point earlier, the efficiencies of these systems are extremely high. And so I think that's a really important thing that we're going to be looking at with the data. On top of that, there should be customer utility bill savings that they see. So their overall heating and cooling costs will go down. And then carbon emissions reductions, as part of the pilot, we're going to quantify those, but just ballparking it up front, we're looking at upwards of 60% emissions reductions for the participating customers. And so I think the really important thing is to look at all aspects of this and say, yes, we're seeing emissions savings. Yes, we're seeing energy savings. And, here's what the system costs to install. And here's a framework for how we can bill and recover these as the utility that doesn't put undue burden on our customers.
Thank you so much. We're going to return to talk about this pilot, but I want to go back to Christy.
Yes.
What does the thermal energy network ecosystem currently look like in the United States? Where are they most advantageous to deploy? Are there any key examples you would highlight as case studies or best practices, or any ongoing projects that you'd like our audience to know about?
Well, I think it's interesting because there's so many geothermal projects out there that I think, like you mentioned, Boise, Idaho has a huge district system that's been going on for, like you said, for a century, and people are just like, what? There's one. Yeah, there's one out there. Colorado Mesa University has one. Cornell campus, Roosevelt Island, Ithaca. There's so many that are ongoing, and there's been so much recent activity recognizing that that it's a useful scientific process. I'm actually speaking right now. I'm at a conference in Houston, and it's so funny to me that I hear a consistent message of this new technology, or this, how it's so advanced and how it's so unexpected. And I keep going, well, it's science. It works. We know it works. We have these great projects, not just in New York. We have projects globally that are putting in district systems, that are putting in what we call open loop, right? Pump and re-inject. And I look at this and I think, people say, oh, well, you have to be really careful for water usage and everything. And I think, well, okay, but if you're going into the aquifer and you're returning water to the aquifer, comparing that to using cooling towers, which evaporate all this water. And I go, okay, this is a much safer system. When you use geothermal and you're using a closed loop or using an open loop, these are the systems that we really want to see. And so I look at things like Framingham and the U10 projects, or the utility thermal energy network projects that are being put in, like in places like Illinois, that has a bill that is being processed right now. Minnesota, New Jersey, New York's state 9422 bill that the Governor Hochul passed. Oregon, there's Utah, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Washington, Wisconsin, all these states that are seeing the brilliance of putting geothermal in because it makes sense. And so projects are just starting to grow. And I think that now we have to make sure that these projects are being put in a way that is smart, that is scientifically backed, and stop having this mindset that this is a science project. Science. It's not. This is not grade school. This is not research and development. This is actual science. And so a lot of the projects that we see, much like Framingham, is that this is science that works. Let's just move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've been definitely reading that in addition to being more energy efficient, it's also more water efficient to do a thermal energy network. And it's more usually often space efficient, right? Because it's underground.
Yeah. It's underground. And when you think about a geothermal, a ground source heat pump fits in a closet. It fits in the same space in your, where an air handler would, but it's indoors. So for those of you who had to go through, Superstorm Sandy or hurricanes or winterization that destroys your outdoor equipment, this isn't that problem anymore, And so I have a hard time seeing why we have so many subsidies given to other energies, and yet geothermal is still sitting at that 1% from the government. And I go, well, we decrease the energy, the energy by 33%, so we don't have that peak load that breaks the grid, and yet there's not the financial backing behind it that so many other, I wouldn't call them science projects, but so many other sciences are getting right now. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult. Yeah.
We'll come back to the subsidies and the incentives and the policies later in our conversation. Love to dig into that in a second, but yeah. I'll go back to Eric. In your opinion, what is the role of the utility in supporting building electrification, and in particular in regard to enabling thermal energy networks and retrofitting existing infrastructure?
Yeah, I'd say this does potentially touch a little bit on that policy and strategy that you were just referring to. But I think the important thing to remember is that, the utility as of right now is owning and operating our energy grids. And so when we're talking about thermal energy networks, ultimately we're looking at electrification of load. And so from that standpoint, we currently understand how the system is planned out, and we understand what the implications of adding a lot of electric load are. So one of the really neat things about geothermal networks is that the load increase is significantly lower than if we were to go over to something like air source heat pumps. And so we can use these to strategically look at areas that may be load constrained and say, well, we may not be able to convert folks over to air source heat pumps, but what if we put a geothermal loop here? That would mitigate a lot of those load implications. I think that's one important piece. The other one is just from a project and a capital standpoint, doing your own private geothermal installation is not cheap. So if folks go out to look at converting their own home, it's a significant cost implication. Where we can come in as the utility is to say, well, if we own and install that infrastructure, the boreholes, the mains in the street, that takes a significant cost burden up front off of the customer, allows them to focus on potentially just installing a heat pump and doing that conversion. And I think it really clears the pathway for getting more of these systems installed that may not otherwise, make sense from a cost standpoint.
Thank you very much. I'd love to now stick with Eric and ask another question about the utility. There's a lot of discussion around refurbishing existing gas lines to support continued gas service, such as what we're talking about now in the District of Columbia. They're just trying to repair and reuse existing gas mains. Do you think utilities will move into the community scale electrification space over expanding or repairing aging gas infrastructure? And why might they choose to go electric?
So in general, and full disclosure here, before working on geothermal networks, I was a gas engineer for the utility. So I was very intimately involved in these types of projects. But I think the real delineation that we need to make and that we try to communicate is that the majority of the gas pipe work is being done from a risk standpoint. So we are looking at aged, risky pipes and trying to mitigate the risk of the gas system. The challenge with networked geothermal is that generally those gas pipes can't be reused for geothermal. From a diameter standpoint, the way that they're routed, the way that the network is built out, the chances that you're going to find a gas line that you can then put geothermal fluid through are very, very low. And so the way that we're thinking about it is we can begin installing these geothermal networks and provide customers the option to switch over. And so as that demand grows and as folks want to connect to the network, we think that gives them a very natural, easy way to convert over rather than trying to force them to or saying, hey, we're retiring this gas line, you don't have a choice.
And do you anticipate sort of gas service and district geothermal service sort of existing in complement at the same time for a while as these systems grow? Or
I think that's probably the reality of where these systems are going to end up, is that, we're going to continue to install networked geothermal as that becomes more popular. And hopefully it serves as a nice springboard to give customers the option to move over to a clean, renewable energy.
Thank you. And I'd like to remind our audience, please send over your questions through the YouTube channel. We'd like to bring them in as we go along, so don't be shy. Please engage with us. I'd like to go back to Chrissy to talk about our policies. We talked about health. So how is the evolving public policy landscape impacting the development of thermal energy networks across the country? So you mentioned, like, last year, New York enacted a bill authorizing the establishment of thermal energy networks. And just last week, the week before, they had a statewide electrification ordinance for new buildings. I know Colorado has been investing a lot, both the political capital and financing, for geothermal energy, both district and household. And Vermont just last week or the week before put in the first in the country clean heat standard, which will establish electrification as the default going forward in the state. So what's the story going on in your markets, Christy? And what do you see going on in the country writ large with these new policies?
Well, once again, I think that what we're seeing more than anything is the acknowledgement that that thermal energy networks work, that they lower the electrical need by, like I said, by like 33%, like Eric said. You can get more bang for your buck, basically. You're not going to take out the grid. They are, beneficial electrification. They are decarbonizing. It's what we need to see. Unfortunately, if you ask people on the street, they either don't know what they are, or if if you just tell them, hey, they're a little expensive to put in, then most people's their answer is just going to be, no, I don't want it. And it's really funny because you say, okay, you're going to pay, 2% more now, and in the end, you're going to save money. I think naturally most people just say, no, I don't want to pay 2% more now. And that's unfortunate, because what we really need people to understand is our infrastructure is crumbling and we need to replace pipes. But do you really want to replace something with what's going to end up being a stranded asset? It's really funny. If you think back to the 70s, people were not willing to pay for a catalytic converter until it was mandated. But if you ask people, for $1,000, we need you to put this on your car so that everybody's air is cleaner, nobody was willing to pay $1,000 to put it on their car until it was required. And they just added it to the price of the car. And guess what? Everybody had to have one. It's the same thing right now. We need to understand, and we need legislators and congressmen and the people who make the decision to just understand this is what needs to happen. Our infrastructure needs help. We need to find a way to get better energy at a lower cost. And we just need to make moves. We need to do it the right way.
Are there any states or local areas that we should be looking at? Anything coming up? Anything in the pipeline that we should keep our eyes on?
Well, I think some cities in the East, I know that in 2021, Philadelphia had a feasibility done for Philadelphia, because they're one of the only municipality-owned networks or districts. And so the gas district there had a feasibility study done. Wisconsin Marquette University recently had one done. I know the PSC in DC asked for a request for proposals for design and construction for a large community heat pump system. And recently, Washington State actually filed 2 House bills to allow for electric and gas utilities to do district energy. So just allowing for states asking to allow for energy and BTUs to be sold by utilities is a great step in the right direction. It means that they're going to allow utilities to allow BTUs to be sold, which allows for thermal energy systems to be put in. And these are just good steps forward. We just need people to allow to talk to their senators and congressmen and say that they want a geothermal option. They don't need to be as expensive as they are. We just need the opportunity to make the case is really more than anything. And you understand that. You do policy and policy and analysis, so this is true.
Absolutely. And a good case, I like to mention this as a good story, is I'm from Texas. There's a community outside of Austin called Whisper Valley. And the entire community in Whisper Valley was built as a sort of a master design or urban design community with geothermal district heating. Essentially, it was called a geogrid system. Every home has solar panels. Every home has geothermal heating and cooling. And during our deep freeze we had in 2021, that community was probably one of the most resilient in the state. And that deep freeze hit every county almost in the whole state. And that particular area was able to get back up and running with heating and electricity much earlier than the rest of the surrounding area. So I think there's a great case to be made for the safety that they provide, as well as the cost savings, energy savings, and the emission savings that they also offer to the people who use them. I'd love to pop over now talking about federal policy and federal investment. So this is for both of you, but let's start with Eric. So are the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, those two landmark pieces of climate legislation that were passed over the past 3 years, are these two bills, how are they working to support the development of thermal energy networks? And how important right now are funding programs or tax credits on the state, federal, or local levels to scaling our thermal energy networks nationwide?
So I think there are kind of two pieces to that, in the sense that from the Eversource standpoint, being the utility, we are able to leverage a lot of those tax incentives in the federal bills and help offset some of the costs of projects like our ongoing pilot. The benefit there is that, less costs go to our ratepayers and the projects are overall more likely to be successful. I think there is a challenge on the residential side, though, and it kind of gets back to what Christy said, just knowledge of what is out there and educating customers and people that could take advantage of these credits. I can't tell you how many people I talk to that have no idea about the federal credits, the local state incentives, or even how ground source systems work. And so if I'm seeing that even within the utility and energy industry, it's not a surprise that your everyday customer has no idea that these tax incentives are even available. So I think they are important and they help support the industry and get projects like this off the ground and going. But there is also that communication and education component that's very important. And I think we're still working on that piece. When we went out to get customers to sign up for our pilot, we were extremely successful once we were actually able to sit down and talk to them. But if you knock on a random person's door and say, hey, I want to talk to you about a networked geothermal system, they have no idea what you're talking about. And so there still is a long way to go on that front. And I think we need to continue developing materials, gathering data, educating folks, and we'll see some progress.
Amazing. Well, it's tip of the sword for this. So hopefully this is just the beginning. Over to you, Christy. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's funny. I belong to a couple of different organizations. Geothermal Rising is one of them, and of course, Women in Geothermal. And we do a lot of reaching out through these organizations to educate, to let people know. Through the organization, these are what's available. I know the IRA, we did a lot of reading, and I know Eric and I talked about this earlier. It's like our consistent bedtime story, rereading, because what I read is not what Eric reads, and there's so much, personal inflection and everything. And so, and that's one of the reasons that these two organizations that I mentioned, we constantly talk to one another and try to make sure that we are making sure that our message is constantly getting out through the networks, and we're letting people know, and just always marketing to try to make sure that everybody knows what geothermal is, and that it has these great federal incentives and state incentives. And there's always a way to try to get as much money into these programs as possible. But there's always the need for more. And it's constant education and just remarketing and just recalling out to people that geothermal is out there and it works. And so anything the federal, government can do to continue this message and make it better is it's all gravy for me.
Love it. I know for a fact from our first podcast, one of the sort of the leaders at the Geothermal Technologies Office, Alexis McKittrick, just announced the release of an RFP specifically on building coalitions around the deployments of community scale geothermal technologies. So I see the GTO putting out some money, and hopefully we'll see additional rounds of funding go out for that particular project. So we're running out of time. We're going to end with our lightning round question. This is a tradition here at Buildings Hub Live. So in 1 minute or less, I'd love to hear what your vision is for the future of thermal energy networks and what developments you anticipate that we'll see in the next 5 or 10 years. And let's start with Eric.
Yeah, so from my standpoint at the utility, we have this first pilot project up and going, but I'm excited to look at other opportunities throughout our broader service territory and potentially look at expanding on the current project as we get going here. And so a lot of confidence that these systems will obviously perform. We know the technology works. And so I think it's really just a matter of getting them in the ground, gathering the data, and marching forward to get more of them.
Thank you. And Christy?
Working with some of my .org friends like Heat and Sane and some of my other New York friends, and also working with some of my Hot Rock friends to get some of that power from the earth and then cascaded down into some direct use thermal energy projects, and see both sides of the sandbox come together and show everyone that it can happen anywhere.
That's right. Geothermal anywhere. That's the big tagline for our 21st century geothermal industry. It's not just a niche technology. It's coming to a home or a community near you.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for our conversation, but I want to say thank you very much to the both of you and our speakers for joining us to provide your expertise and your insight. To everyone here in our live audience who participated in our discussion today, should you wish to rewatch this episode or share it with your friends or colleagues, you can find it on the Atlas YouTube page, as well as on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. We encourage you to check out our Buildings Hub platform and join our electrification community today. We just launched, again, our new dashboard surfacing all of the data from the latest DOE residential energy consumption survey, which I'll also mention does have information on geothermal heat pumps and market share across all 50 states, in addition to other heat pump deployment metrics, induction cooking, home heating fuel mixes, and more. Check it out. I think it's pretty cool. We hope you'll catch the next episode of Buildings Hub Live. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Buildings Hub Live. You can listen to this episode and all other installments of Buildings Hub Live on our Atlas YouTube channel. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you're interested in additional content, check out our data, articles, and dashboards at atlasbuildingshub.com. Thanks for joining, and we'll catch you next time.